Welcome to the Wilsonville Public Library Genealogy Club. Today's topic, how did he get there? Lessons learned from the search for my great-grandfather. My name is Malia LAUGHTON. I've been a librarian at the Wilsonville Public Library since 2004. I've been doing genealogy for about 31 years. This is James Willie LAUGHTON. He is my great-grandfather on my paternal side of the family, and I knew very little about him. In fact, what I knew, I could count on one hand. He was born in Sheffield, England, married Florence Trick in 1905 in Vermont, had one son, my grandfather Armin, and he died in 1938. After that, I knew nothing else. So I decided to make him my genealogy project for the day. To start out, I wrote out some research questions, and I decided to focus on how did he arrive in Vermont? I thought this would be an easy question to answer. I knew there was records out there that should provide the answer. It turned out that this was not an easy question to answer. It took me on a path that I never expected to go on, and I learned about a group of immigrants that I had no idea existed. So, I'm going to take you on my journey with me, and I'll show you how I did it. My first step was to talk to my family and find out what they knew about my great-grandfather. My father remembered that he had a letter from his father about James Willie. It was a handwritten letter in pencil on lined notebook paper, and it was almost a complete biography about James Willie. He let me know that he was born on March 17th, 1880. However, my great-grandmother Florence believed it was 1881. He enlisted in the Army on the 6th of February in 1899 and was medically discharged due to malaria on Angel Island in 1902. His father's name was Thomas Lawton, with a slight spelling in the surname. Instead of an L-A-U, like I spell my last name, this was L-O-U. Didn't know what his mother's name was, but believed that she died when James Willie was 3 years old. He had 6 siblings: Tom, Jack, Happy, Emma, Polly, and another sister, but I didn't know what her name was. And at the age of 9, James Willie was an orphan when his father died in a construction accident. Taking that information, I created a timeline, adding in 1880 as being his birth and ending in 1938 with his death, throwing in the other clues that I found in this letter with the parents' deaths, his enlistment in Plattsburgh, New York for the Army, which gave me about a 10-year gap of when he could have come to the U.S. The other clues that I had from this letter was about his life in England. When he became an orphan, he moved in with his female siblings and had some formal schooling. At one point, he runs away from his sister's home because she used the strap on him. And he walks from Sheffield to Liverpool, which is about 70 to 80 miles. Gets on a ship to Canada and arrives in Montreal. Once he's in the U.S., he answers an ad for farmhands on the Isle of Lamont, which is located in the Lake Champlain area between Vermont and New York. He lived and worked for a Mr. Osborne and attended school with their daughter Bertha. This family wanted to adopt him, however, James Willie refused. He fights in the Philippines insurrection, and after the war, he worked as a merchant. My next step is to verify the story. So I start with looking up the most recent record I can find, which ends up being the death record and the obituary. And in here, I noticed that birthday is listed as 17th of March, 1880. However, in the obituary, somebody had hand corrected it and put 1881. and the parents' names are listed as William Lawton and Mary Walker. I then found the marriage record, and I find out that his parents' names are listed as Thomas Lawton and Emma Walker. And based on the age of when he got married, his birth year comes out to being 1881. Next, I found the military records, and again, I have a birth year now of 1880. When I start comparing the information, all the records agreed his name was some variation of James William or James Willie, married to Florence Trick, and was born either 1880 or 1881. Now, when it comes to these records, you can put your confidence in them to a percentage. With the death and obituary, because that information is provided by the survivor, I don't put a lot of confidence in the information because their memories could be faulty, they might not know, and they're just guessing. So I take that stuff with a grain of salt. When it comes to a marriage record, typically that information is being provided by the people involved, so I put a little more confidence in that. Same thing with military records. A lot of them are provided information by the person involved. Still, there could be errors, somebody writes down the information wrong, or maybe the person involved lies because they want to join the military and they're not the right age. So I need to find more records to kind of narrow down what year James Willie was born. Hopefully I can find a birth certificate. When it came to the parents' names, I still wasn't sure if it was going to be Thomas Lawton and Emma Walker or William Lawton and Mary Walker. Hopefully that birth certificate would give me the information. And it's possible that these names are maybe middle names or nicknames. When it came to the siblings, by the time he died, only 4 of his siblings were left, and the one that I didn't recognize was a lady named Mary. She could have been the other sister, or maybe that was the birth name of Polly. And finally, they all agreed that he fought in the Philippines insurrection and was discharged at Angel Island. The next step is to cross the pond. I couldn't afford to actually fly to England and search the records in person, but thankfully I had some databases that allowed me to search their records. And I started out with birth records, and I happened to find a James Willie listed, and he was born on the 17th of March in 1881, so now I knew what year to go by. He was baptized on the 26th of April in 1881, and his parents' names are Thomas Lawton and Emma Walker. So I am now satisfied. I know when he's born and who his parents were. I then started searching for the death certificates to find out when they died and when James Willie became an orphan. Found the father's death certificate. He died in 1884 of a construction accident, and that makes James Willie about 3 years old when he died. James Willie's mother was Emma Hannah Walker Lawton, and she died on the 10th of December in 1886, and that made James Willie 5 years old when he became an orphan officially. Back to that timeline where I had my 10-year gap. I've put in the correct information, and now I have a 13-year gap. I was hoping to have a smaller gap. However, now that I have the correct birth dates and the correct dates of his parents, I had to live with the fact that my gap grew. The next thing I did was search the UK census records, with him being born in 1881 in April, is when that census occurred. I figured James Willie had to be listed. He was born in March, so why not? And I was able to find him, or at least who I believed it was him. They were living in Brightside in England, not far from Sheffield, and he was listed as a Fred Willie Lawton. I'm not sure where this name Fred came from. However, knowing that he was baptized on the 26th of April of 1881, my belief is that his name just was changed. He was originally called Fred, and they decided to name him James. I then decided to go to the next census year that I could find, which was 1891, and in the hopes of figuring out if James Willie was actually living with his siblings. When I did a search just for James Willie in general, I couldn't find him. I even looked under Fred Willie, could not find him. When I checked for his siblings, he wasn't living with any of them either, which meant now I had to go to extended family. And James Willie's mother, Emma, had a brother named James Walker, and in 1891 he had a nephew living with him named James W. Walker. Now, I was hoping it would say Lawton, but because the age was right and the family connection was right, I felt pretty confident that this was actually my James Willie that I've been searching for, and it was just a error on the census taker by assuming that his name was Walker and not a different surname. So now I can update my timeline and say that in 1891 he's living with his uncle in Sheffield, which now takes that 13-year gap and makes it 8 years. And now I'm going in the right direction, shrinking my gap of when he could have arrived in Vermont. But I'm still not positive on how he got there. So I'm going to have to do a little more research. I went to the passenger records and searching through, knowing my gap area, and I couldn't find him in Ellis Island records. I couldn't even find him in Castle Garden. When I came to the Canadian records, I did find a record for a James Lawton, but he was 17 years old, which would have meant that he was born in 1877, and that was just too much of a difference from 1881 for me. And this James Lawton arrived in 1894 on the Parisian. So James Willie in that year would have been 13 years old. So I decided it couldn't be him. And I just moved on. I then went to the Canadian records, thinking that maybe they had a database that wasn't in Ancestry, and went through all of those records, could not find him. He did not exist. But I did find one thing that intrigued me. There was a database called Home Children, 1869 to 1932. I had no idea what this was related to, but they were immigration records, so I decided, what the heck, why not check it out? Worst that can happen is I lose some time researching, but this isn't a hobby that is quick and easy, so it really wasn't a waste. And to my surprise, I actually found a James Lawton listed. He was 14 years old, he arrived in 1894, and he arrived on a ship called the Parisian. And suddenly, something clicked in my brain, and it's like, wait, you know that ship name. Where have you seen that before? And I remembered the Canadian passenger list in Ancestry. The ship was the Parisian, but this is the one that said that he was 17 years old. So now I decided I better look at this record a little more closely. Maybe it was a transcription error. And when I pulled it up, no, the age looks like 17. So I still wanted to dismiss it. But I said I had to look at this a little more closely. So I zoomed in, and I don't know if it was my eyes playing tricks on me or I just really wanted to see something, but it looked like part of the corner of the 4 had faded away a bit, making it look like a 17, but it was really 14. I also noticed that these children were all grouped by ages. 10 and 11-year-olds were all in a group, 12, 13, 14-year-olds were all in a group. On the other pages, I had 15, 16, and 17-year-olds all in a group. And so I wondered, if he was 17, why wasn't he with all the other 17-year-olds? So I started leaning towards maybe my eyes weren't playing tricks on me, and that really was a 14. I also noticed that all of these children were going to get onto a train after they arrived and head to a place called Knowlton, Quebec. And that city sounded familiar as well. When I went back to the Home Children database, I noticed that he was part of a party called the Liverpool Sheltering Home, with Louisa Britt as being the head of the group, and they were heading to Knowlton, Quebec. I'm really hoping that this really is my great-grandfather, but I need to know more about this database to find out why is he listed in it and what can I learn. Home children, or also known as the British home children, were orphaned, abandoned, or poor children who were sent to Canada in hopes to have a better life. Between 1869 and the late 1930s, over 100,000 juvenile immigrants were sent to Canada. They were sent by churches and charity groups in hopes that these children would have a healthy moral life in rural Canada, and it also provided a cheap form of farm labor and domestic help for these host families. I'm not sure if these children had good lives or bad lives. When you read more about these children, you get both sides of the story. Some of them got lucky and they got great families and they were adopted, and others were treated as employees. They were there to work and that was it. Nothing else. I'm not sure if my great-grandfather, which group he would belong to. I hope he had good families, but there's always the possibility that he didn't. I next researched the Liverpool Sheltering Home and found out it was a home for destitute children. This home was inspired by the work of Annie McPherson, who was out of East London, and she was a strong promoter for child immigration to Canada. The Liverpool Sheltering Home was run by her sister, Louisa Britt, and the records from the sheltering home had actually survived. They were inherited by an orphanage called BARNARDO'S, which was still in existence today. Going back to my timeline, I decided to put in 1894 as when he possibly left England and arrived in Canada, which then put down my gap to about 5 years of when he could have arrived in the US, and specifically the Vermont area. Because I'm still thinking that he's living with the Osborne family in this area, or this time frame. Next, I went to the Barnardo's Family History Service to find out if I could find their records and confirm that the James Lawton in their records was my James Willie. And I was hoping just to be able to search their database, but they didn't have it online. I actually had to pay for somebody to do the research for me. And it was coming in 2 different groups. The first part was to do an initial research, which was going to cost about £15 or about $21. And that only allowed them to check to see if that name was in their records. It wouldn't prove that it was my James Lawton, just that that name occurred. If they did find his name, I then was given the opportunity to pay for the full admission record, which was about £85 or about $122. I could possibly get a photograph with this record, but $140 was a lot to pay on a guess. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to gamble. I spoke with my parents, my dad's question to me was, how confident do I feel that this was my James Willie? And it was around 60 to 70%. And my dad felt that was good enough for him. We could afford to spend the money, and if you look at it, no matter what, we were going to learn something, so it's still a win. So we agreed to gamble, and we hit the jackpot. Oh my goodness, did we hit the jackpot. It was amazing. 3 months after sending in the information, we received a packet in the mail, and it had 2 sheets of 11 by 17 paper, and it opened up a part of James Willie's life that we did not expect, and confirmed quite a bit in the story that we were given, but also disproved a lot of the story. In fact, here's what we learned. In June of 1893, he runs away from his uncle's home in Sheffield and walks to Leeds, stays there for about 7 weeks carrying parcels, and then heads on to Bradford, where he worked as a shoeblack. From there, he meets a boy, and the two of them walk back to Leeds, then on to Huddersfield, Manchester, and then finally arriving in Liverpool. The Liverpool sheltering home is where they ended up. And if you think about these sheltering homes, they're similar to kind of like a homeless shelter. It was a place for these children to get off the streets for the night, have a safe place to sleep, get a warm meal, and then they could also do some odd jobs, such as carrying parcels or being shoeblacks. He is entered into the sheltering home in September of 1893. He states that he's 14 years old, or maybe they assumed he was 14 because he was tall for his age. It confirmed his siblings' names as well as parents' names. After about 10 days at the sheltering home, he and his friend run away to Manchester on September 22nd. And then on October 3rd, they're being sent back from Manchester to Liverpool from the Strangeways house. Strangeways house was another one of these shelters for destitute children, and it was run by a children's aid society. But it was also the name of a prison that was about a block away from this home. So I don't know if James Willie was in trouble and that's how he got put into Strangeways house, or if he just was looking for food and shelter for the night. But either way, he ends up back in Liverpool. There were some interesting comments also on these documents. One of them was from Manchester saying that my great-grandfather was sorry for running away and that they should forgive him and allow him back into Liverpool. And then there was also talk about how he wasn't dependable and not very pleasant, and he had fair schooling. My guess is because he was a teenager at the time, or a preteen. He just was having terrible teenage years. In 1894, James Willie and about 300 other children are placed on a ship called the Parisian and are sent to Canada. Once in Canada, they hop on a train and go to a place called Knowlton, Quebec, where they enter into the Knowlton House, which is run by Louisa Bird. And this is where the children are placed with families throughout Canada to work as domestic help. However, James Willie is actually placed with families in New York. His first family is the Walter Dickinson family, and he lives with them for almost a month. And there's a note saying that they're returning him because the boy's not satisfied. I'm not sure if he's not satisfied and they really mean James Willie was not satisfied and that actually was a consideration, or if the Dickinson family was just putting blame on James Willie so that, who knows, not really sure. What I do know is he's placed with a second family in May of 1894, and he lives with them for about 2 years, and it's the Richard Scales family. And he has a really good report with them, saying that he's in good health and conduct. He's going to school and going to church on a regular basis. He's interested in his home and training to be a farmer. But after 2 years, he's then placed with a third family called the E.P. Shute family. Now he's tall and full of talk about saving $10. He apparently left the Scales family shabbily. I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that, if it's just his clothing wasn't in good repair or if he got into trouble with the Scales family. However, James Willie is still seen in church and Sunday school, and by 1898 he has left the Shutes family, and at this time he would have been about 17 years old. And knowing that in February of 1899 he joins the military, my guess is that he just felt it was time that he was an adult. He didn't need to live with the family anymore. So adding all this information into my timeline, I can now put in that he arrived in Canada in 1894. He's also placed with families in New York in 1894. And then by 1898, he has left these families. And I'm down to a 7-year gap from a 5-year gap to when he could have found the Osborne family in Vermont and lived with them before enlisting in the Army. So this was a wild and crazy journey, and I had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot about the home children. I never knew that that group of immigrants existed and what their lives were like, and I'm still actually learning more about them. But I also learned some lessons that will help me with future genealogy projects, such as verify your family stories. There are records out there that will support those stories, and they're entertaining. So find the records that support it. The other thing is don't dismiss a document without checking it out. You want to make sure that you don't miss something. And in my case, I dismissed that passenger record, and maybe had I looked at it more closely, I might have had considered it some more. But then again, I might not have learned about those home children the way I did. So, who knows? It's a catch-22 on that one. But the other thing is be curious about databases. Even if you don't think your ancestors in them, check them out. It's a lot of fun to just search for names. I have done this with quite a few databases, and I'm usually surprised by what I find out. I'm not expecting to find names, and I do, and they open up a wealth of information on my ancestors. The other thing is maybe it's worth gambling on a document. If you can afford to do it, why not pay the money and get that document? Either way, you're still going to win. You're going to either find out that it's not your ancestor, or you find out it is, and you break down your brick wall. Finally, keep a timeline. These timelines organize all your information, show you where your gaps are, and also give you ideas of other records to check out. Maybe you'll notice that he was alive during a war and you need to look for military records. Definitely keep a timeline. In the end, don't ever give up. If you fail, you just need to try another way. Those records are out there. And I truly believe that if we think creatively, we can find those records, uncover where our ancestors are hiding. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Good luck in your research.